I heard the piano before I saw her. The melody drifted through the community center's cracked windows like smoke, delicate and haunting, each note falling with the precision of someone who'd been classically trained since childhood. I paused on the front steps, my hand frozen on the heavy wooden door, listening to a piece I recognized but couldn't quite place. Mozart, maybe, or one of the earlier Chopin nocturnes. Whoever was playing had talent that belonged on concert stages, not in our little mountain town's dusty community center where the piano bench wobbled and half the keys stuck in humid weather. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. The music stopped abruptly as I pushed through the door, the sudden silence almost jarring after such beauty. Behind the old upright piano sat a woman I'd never seen before, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She wore a cream-colored sweater that looked soft as cashmere, and jeans that fit like they'd been tailored specifically for her. Everything about her screamed money and city sophistication, from her manicured nails to the expensive watch catching afternoon light through the windows. She looked up when she heard my footsteps echoing across the worn hardwood floor, and I found myself staring into eyes the color of autumn leaves. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt suddenly aware of my faded flannel shirt and work boots, the sawdust probably still clinging to my hair from the morning shift at Henderson's lumberyard. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone educated at private schools. "I didn't realize anyone else would be here." The woman at the diner said the community center was usually empty this time of day. "It usually is," I replied, setting down the case containing my own sheet music. "I come here to practice when Luke's at school. Don't mind me, please continue." That was beautiful. A flush colored her cheeks, and for the first time since I'd entered, she looked less composed, more human. "Thank you. I was just working through some rust. It's been months since I've had access to a decent piano." I couldn't help but smile at that. Decent was a generous way to describe the community center's instrument. The thing was older than both of us combined, with keys yellowed from decades of use and a sound that could charitably be called character-rich. But it was the only piano for 50 miles, and it had been my sanctuary for the past 3 years, ever since I'd moved to Cedar Falls with my 8-year-old son. "Mind if I ask what brings you to our corner of nowhere?" I said, moving closer to the piano. "We don't get many classically trained musicians passing through." Her smile faltered slightly, and I caught something guarded creeping into her expression. "Just needed a change of scenery. Sometimes you have to get away from the noise to remember what actually matters." The woman introduced herself as Emma, though she hesitated just slightly before saying her name, as if she were trying it on for size. She didn't offer a last name, and something in her manner suggested I shouldn't ask. In a town like Cedar Falls, where everyone knew everyone else's business going back 3 generations, anonymity was both rare and usually deliberate. "Are you a teacher?" she asked, nodding toward my music case. "You have that patient look about you." I laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the empty hall. "Close. I work at the lumberyard during the day, but I give piano lessons in the evenings. Nothing fancy. Mostly kids whose parents think music might keep them out of trouble." "And does it?" "Sometimes." I thought of Tyler Morrison, who'd been headed for juvenile detention before discovering he had a gift for jazz improvisation, or Sarah Chen, who'd found her voice through music after being too shy to speak up in class. Music has a way of reaching people where words can't. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Emma's fingers moved absently over the keys, not pressing down but tracing patterns I couldn't decipher. "What about you? What does music reach in you?" The question caught me off guard with its directness, its intimacy. Most people in Cedar Falls knew better than to ask about the deeper currents of my life. They knew I was Michael Torres, single father who'd moved here from Denver 3 years ago. They knew my wife had died, and that I was raising Luke alone. They knew I worked hard, kept to myself, and played piano at the community center when I thought no one was listening. They didn't ask what music meant to me, because in small towns, some stories were understood without being told. But Emma wasn't from here, and her question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Music is where I put the things I can't say, I answered finally, surprised by my own honesty. Where I put the grief and the hope and all the spaces in between. She nodded as if she understood exactly what I meant, and I realized that whatever had brought her to Cedar Falls, whatever she was running from or toward, music was part of that story too. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma became a fixture at the community center. She arrived every afternoon around 2, always impeccably dressed despite the casual mountain town atmosphere, always carrying the same leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to feed my family for a month. We developed an unspoken schedule. She would play first, filling the space with classical pieces that made the old building feel like a concert hall, and then I would take my turn, working through the contemporary arrangements I taught my students, or the jazz standards that reminded me of better times. We talked in fragments between songs, sharing musical preferences and technical observations, while carefully avoiding anything too personal. I learned that she had studied at Juilliard, though she deflected questions about her career with the same practiced grace she used to navigate difficult passages in Rachmaninoff. She learned that I had once played in a wedding band in Denver, back when my wife Anna was alive and Luke was just learning to walk, though I didn't offer details about why those days had ended. The community center piano began to sound better under Emma's attention. She must have had it tuned, though she never mentioned it directly. One morning I arrived to find that someone had left a bottle of wood polish and a soft cloth by the bench, and over the following days the instrument's case regained some of its original luster. Small improvements appeared regularly, new sheet music on the stand, a cushion for the wobbly bench, even a small lamp that made reading music easier in the afternoon shadows. "You don't have to do this," I told her one Thursday when I found a humidifier running quietly in the corner, something that would help protect the piano's aging wood and strings. "Do what?" she asked innocently, though her smile suggested she knew exactly what I meant. "Turn our little community center into Carnegie Hall. This piano has survived decades of church potlucks and high school band practice. It doesn't need pampering." "Everything needs care," she said, running her fingers along the piano's restored finish. "Just because something is old or forgotten doesn't mean it has lost its value. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from instruments that have stories to tell." There was something in the way she said it that made me think she wasn't just talking about the piano. I wanted to ask what story she was telling. What had brought someone with her obvious talent and resources to a place like Cedar Falls? But every time I approached the subject, she redirected the conversation with the skill of someone practiced in deflection. Luke met Emma on a Friday, when school let out early, due to a teacher training day. I had forgotten about the schedule change, and arrived at the community center to find my 8-year-old son sitting cross-legged on the floor, listening with rapt attention, as Emma played a simplified version of Fur Elise that somehow retained all of the original's emotional depth. "Dad!" Luke jumped up when he saw me, his backpack sliding off his shoulder. "Did you know Emma went to the same music school as the people in those videos you showed me? The ones where they play in the fancy hall with all the lights." Emma's hands stilled on the keys, and I caught a flicker of something that might have been panic in her expression before she composed herself. "Your son has been excellent company," she said carefully. "He has good musical instincts." "Luke loves music," I said, settling onto the bench beside my son, "though he's more interested in video game soundtracks than classical pieces." "Video game music can be incredibly sophisticated," Emma replied seriously, surprising both of us. "Some of the most innovative composition work being done today is in gaming. The way music can enhance storytelling, create emotional connection, guide the player through different experiences. It's fascinating." Luke's eyes widened with the joy of finding an adult who took his interests seriously. "Do you know the music from Mystic Realms?" "Dad says it's too complicated for me to learn, but I've been practicing the main theme." "Show me," Emma said, sliding over to make room on the bench. For the next hour, I watched my son and this mysterious woman work together on a piece that I had indeed dismissed as too advanced. Emma broke it down into manageable sections, showed Luke how to use proper fingering to make the reaches easier, and helped him find the rhythm that would make the melody sing. Her teaching style was patient but challenging, pushing Luke to attempt things just beyond his comfort zone while providing the support he needed to succeed. "You're a natural teacher," I told her as Luke gathered his things, already chattering about practicing the new techniques she had shown him. "I had good teachers," she replied, but there was a wistfulness in her voice that suggested teaching wasn't something she did often anymore, or perhaps something she missed doing. As we walked home, Luke peppered me with questions about Emma that I couldn't answer. Where did she live? How long was she staying? Could she teach him more songs? Did I think she would come to his school concert next month? His enthusiasm was infectious, but it also made me realize how much he missed having other adults in his life who shared his interests. In Cedar Falls, he was one of only 3 kids taking piano lessons, and while the other parents were supportive, none of them understood music the way Emma clearly did. That evening, after Luke was asleep, I found myself thinking about the easy way Emma had connected with my son, the natural teaching instincts she had displayed, and the careful way she had avoided any questions about her background or future plans. There were gaps in her story that didn't make sense. Someone with her training and obvious financial resources didn't end up in a place like Cedar Falls by accident. People came here to disappear, to start over, or to escape something they couldn't handle in their previous life. I recognized the signs because I had lived them myself 3 years earlier when grief and medical bills had forced me to sell everything I owned in Denver and start fresh in a place where no one knew my history. The difference was that my arrival in Cedar Falls had been born of necessity and exhaustion. Emma's presence felt more intentional, as if she were waiting for something or someone. The next morning, I arrived at the community center earlier than usual and found Emma already there, but she wasn't playing. She was standing by the window, talking quietly on her phone, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to making important decisions. I caught fragments of conversation that included words like timeline, acquisition, and board meeting before she noticed me and quickly ended the call. "Sorry," she said, slipping the phone into her purse with a kind of smooth motion that suggested practice. "Just checking in with some work obligations." "No problem," I replied, though I couldn't help wondering what kind of work obligations followed someone to a remote mountain town in Colorado. "What line of work are you in?" For a moment, Emma hesitated, and I could see her weighing different responses before settling on one that revealed nothing. "Business consulting," she said finally. Nothing particularly interesting. It was a lie, or at least a significant omission, and we both knew it. But in the unspoken agreement that had developed between us, I didn't press for details, just as she had never pushed me to explain why a man with my musical background was working at a lumber yard in a town with more elk than people. Instead, I opened my music case and pulled out the arrangement I had been working on, a contemporary piece that blended classical structure with jazz harmonies. "Want to try something together?" I asked. "I've been working on this duet arrangement, but it's hard to hear how it fits together when you're only playing one part." Emma's face lit up with genuine pleasure, the first unguarded expression I had seen from her since we met. "I'd love to," she said, moving to share the bench with me. "What's the piece?" "Something I've been arranging from a song my wife used to love," I said, surprising myself with the admission. "It's not classical, but the harmonic structure has some interesting possibilities." As we began to play together, the music filled the space between us with something more intimate than conversation. Our hands moved across the keys in a dance that required trust and attention, creating something neither of us could achieve alone. Emma's classical training provided the technical foundation, while my jazz background added the improvisational elements that gave the piece its emotional depth. Together, we created something new, something that belonged to both of us and neither of us, something that said everything we couldn't put into words about loss and hope and the courage required to begin again. The challenge came on a Tuesday afternoon when the autumn leaves were beginning their final descent from the aspens that lined Main Street. I arrived at the community center to find Emma pacing near the piano, her usual composed demeanor replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. Her phone was buzzing insistently in her purse, but she ignored it with the determination of someone who had been avoiding calls all day. "Everything all right?" I asked, setting down my music case and noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "Fine," she said quickly, then seemed to reconsider. "Actually, no, not fine at all. I think I need to leave Cedar Falls." The words hit me harder than I expected. Over the past month, Emma had become part of my daily routine. Part of Luke's world. Part of something I hadn't realized I was building until faced with its potential loss. The community center would feel empty without her presence. The piano would sound hollow without her skilled fingers bringing out its hidden beauty. "What's happened?" I asked, moving closer but respecting the invisible boundary she maintained around herself when upset. "My father," she said. the words carrying a weight that suggested years of complicated history. "He's found me." Before I could ask what that meant, the community center's front door opened with enough force to rattle the windows. The man who entered commanded attention the way storms command respect, through sheer presence and barely contained power. He was tall and silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my annual salary, and he carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way in all things. "Emma Catherine Morrison," he said, his voice filling the space with authority that made the old building feel smaller. "Enough of this ridiculous charade. Morrison." The name hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly everything made sense. Emma Morrison, daughter of Richard Morrison, the billionaire real estate developer whose company had been quietly buying up property throughout Colorado's mountain communities, Morrison Holdings, the corporation that local newspapers claimed was planning to turn small towns like Cedar Falls into luxury resort destinations, pricing out longtime residents and destroying the character that made these places special. Emma stepped protectively in front of the piano, as if shielding it from her father's presence. "Hello, Richard," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor I could see in her hands. "I wasn't expecting you." Clearly, Richard Morrison's gaze swept over the community center's modest interior with undisguised disdain before settling on me with the kind of assessment that made me feel like an insect under a microscope. "And who might this be? Your latest attempt at rebellion?" "This is Michael Torres," Emma said, lifting her chin with defiance that reminded me of Luke when he was determined to stand his ground. "He's a friend. A friend." Richard's smile held no warmth. How refreshing. Emma's friends are usually CEOs or symphony conductors, not— He paused, taking in my work clothes and calloused hands. "Lumberyard employees." The casual cruelty in his tone made my jaw tighten, but before I could respond, Emma stepped forward with fire in her eyes. "Don't you dare speak to him that way. Michael has more integrity in his little finger than you have in your entire body. Integrity doesn't pay for conservatory educations or maintain the lifestyle you're accustomed to," Richard replied smoothly. "Speaking of which, the board is becoming impatient. Your little sabbatical has gone on long enough. Morrison Holdings needs its heir apparent, not this amateur hour performance you've been staging." "I never agreed to be your heir apparent," Emma shot back. "I have my own life, my own choices to make." "Choices?" Richard laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You mean like hiding in this backwater town, playing children's songs on a piano that belongs in a museum? You're wasting your gifts, Emma. You could be performing at Lincoln Center, recording with major labels, building something significant. Instead, you're here playing house with—" He gestured dismissively toward me. "Whatever this is supposed to be." I felt anger building in my chest, the protective instinct that had kept Luke and me safe for 3 years now extending to include Emma. "With respect, Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice carrying the controlled calm I had learned in my military service years, "your daughter is an adult, capable of making her own decisions about where she wants to be and what she wants to do." Richard turned his full attention to me for the first time, and I understood why Emma had seemed so guarded about her background. This was a man who viewed people as assets or obstacles, who measured worth in terms of utility and influence. "Mr. Torres, isn't it? Tell me, what exactly do you think you have to offer my daughter? What future can a small-town piano teacher provide for someone with her potential? Maybe the future she actually wants," I replied, surprised by my own boldness, "instead of the one you've decided she should have." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Richard Morrison studied me with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey, and I realized that this was how he had built his empire, by intimidating people into submission, by making them feel small and powerless. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than any shout. "Emma has responsibilities, obligations that go far beyond whatever fantasy she's constructed here. Morrison Holdings controls development rights for half the mountain communities in Colorado, including this one. One word from me, and this entire town could be transformed into something more economically viable." The threat was clear, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the community center's old windows. This wasn't just about Emma's personal choices. This was about the future of Cedar Falls, about the families who had lived here for generations, about the community that had given Luke and me a chance to rebuild our lives. "You wouldn't," Emma whispered, her face pale with understanding. "You can't just destroy an entire town because I won't fall in line with your plans." "Can't I?" Richard's smile was cold as winter steel. "Zoning changes, environmental concerns, infrastructure requirements. There are many ways to encourage communities to embrace progress. Of course, if my daughter were to return to her responsibilities at Morrison Holdings, I might find myself feeling more sentimental about preserving these quaint mountain towns." I watched Emma's shoulders sag as the full weight of her father's manipulation settled over her. This wasn't just about her freedom or her career choices. This was about using an entire community as leverage to force her compliance, about holding hundreds of innocent people hostage to his will. "That's not a choice," I said, stepping closer to Emma in a gesture of support. "That's extortion." "That's business," Richard corrected. "And it's a lesson Emma needs to learn if she's going to succeed in the real world. Everything has a price, Mr. Torres. Everyone has pressure points. The sooner she understands that, the sooner she can stop playing these childish games and accept her destiny." Emma looked between her father and me, and I could see the weight of impossible decisions crushing down on her. She had found something here in Cedar Falls, something that had brought light back to her eyes and music back to her heart. But the cost of keeping it was too high, the collateral damage too extensive. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have until Friday," Richard replied, checking his expensive watch with theatrical precision. "The board meets Monday morning, and I expect you to be there, ready to take your place as Morrison Holdings' new creative director. Think of it as a compromise. You can still be involved with music, just on a more appropriate scale." He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back with the timing of someone who understood the power of dramatic moments. "Oh, and Emma, I wouldn't get too attached to this place. Small mountain towns are so vulnerable to economic pressures. It would be a shame if Cedar Falls couldn't adapt to changing times." After he left, the community center felt hollow, as if his presence had sucked all the warmth from the air. Emma sank onto the piano bench, her head in her hands, and I could see her trembling with the effort of holding back tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry you got pulled into this. I never meant for anyone else to get hurt." I sat beside her on the bench, close enough to offer comfort but careful not to crowd her. "It's not your fault. Men like your father create impossible situations and then blame others for the consequences." "But it is my fault," she said, looking up at me with eyes bright with unshed tears. "I came here because I was tired of being Richard Morrison's daughter, tired of having my life planned out for me like a business acquisition. I thought I could disappear for a while, figure out who I wanted to be without his influence. I never thought he would use innocent people as weapons." The weight of her situation settled between us like a living thing. Emma had found freedom in Cedar Falls, had discovered parts of herself that her father's world didn't allow. But that freedom had come with a price that extended far beyond her personal happiness. The community that had unknowingly sheltered her was now at risk because of her presence, and the man who had become important to her was caught in the crossfire of a war he had never chosen to fight. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of our small house settling around us, the whisper of wind through the pine trees outside Luke's window, the distant rumble of the late freight train that carried lumber down the mountain to Denver. These were the sounds of home, of the life we had built from the ashes of our previous existence, and now all of it felt precarious. I kept thinking about Emma's face when her father delivered his ultimatum, the way hope had drained from her expression like water from a broken vessel. She had found something here in Cedar Falls, some piece of herself that had been missing, and now she was being forced to choose between her own happiness and the welfare of an entire community. It was the kind of impossible choice that revealed the true nature of power, how it could corrupt even love into a weapon. By morning, I had made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just weeks earlier. I called in sick to the lumberyard for the first time in 3 years, asked my neighbor Mrs. Patterson to watch Luke after school, and drove into town with a determination that surprised me with its intensity. If Richard Morrison wanted to play games with people's lives, he was going to discover that not everyone in Cedar Falls was willing to be moved around like pieces on his corporate chessboard. The Morrison Holdings regional office was located in a gleaming glass building in Aspen, an hour's drive through mountain passes that gradually transitioned from the rustic charm of working communities to the polished sophistication of resort towns. I had put on my only suit, a charcoal gray ensemble I had worn to Anna's funeral and hadn't touched since, and I felt like an actor playing a role for which I was thoroughly unprepared. The receptionist, a young woman with the kind of practiced smile that suggested she was paid well to be pleasant to people she didn't particularly like, informed me that Mr. Morrison was in meetings all day and wasn't seeing unscheduled visitors. I told her I would wait, settling into one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and prepared for a siege that could last hours. It turned out I didn't have to wait long. Word traveled quickly in buildings like this one, and within 30 minutes Richard Morrison himself appeared in the lobby, his expression a mixture of amusement and annoyance that suggested he found my presence more entertaining than threatening. "Mr. Torres," he said, approaching with the confident stride of someone who owned every space he entered. "How unexpected. I trust you're not here to waste my time with romantic notions about true love conquering all." "I'm here to make you a deal," I said, standing to meet him at eye level. "Though I suppose you'd call it a negotiation." His eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "A negotiation? How fascinating. And what exactly do you think you have to offer that could possibly interest Morrison Holdings?" "Information," I replied, pulling a folder from my briefcase, one I had spent the morning assembling with the help of Luke's computer, and several calls to friends in Denver who understood legal documentation. "About the environmental impact studies your company filed for the Cedar Falls development project." For the first time since I had met him, Richard Morrison's composure slipped slightly. His eyes narrowed as he took in the folder, the careful way I held it, the confidence in my voice that suggested I wasn't bluffing. "My office," he said curtly, gesturing toward the elevator with movements that had lost some of their earlier smoothness. 5 minutes. His office occupied an entire corner of the top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. It was a space designed to intimidate, with its massive desk, expensive artwork, and the kind of power furniture that made visitors feel small and inconsequential. But I had spent years in military briefing rooms where life-and-death decisions were made, and I understood that authority was often more about perception than reality. "Let's dispense with the theatrics," Richard said, settling behind his desk like a general preparing for battle. "What do you think you know about Morrison Holdings' development plans?" I opened the folder and spread its contents across his polished desk surface. Environmental surveys, water rights documentation, zoning variance applications, and most importantly, a geological study that revealed significant concerns about soil stability in the areas where Morrison Holdings planned to build luxury condominiums. "I know that your company has been selectively editing environmental reports to minimize concerns about watershed protection," I said, watching his face carefully for reactions. "I know that the luxury resort development you're planning would require water usage that exceeds the local aquifer's sustainable capacity. And I know that your geological consultants identified serious concerns about building on the eastern slopes above Cedar Falls, concerns that somehow didn't make it into the final reports submitted to the County Planning Commission." Richard's fingers drummed against the desktop, a rhythmic tapping that suggested he was calculating odds and consequences with the speed of someone who had built an empire on reading situations correctly. "Even if any of that were true," he said carefully, "it would hardly constitute grounds for halting a development project worth hundreds of millions of dollars." "Maybe not," I agreed, pulling out the final document from my folder. "But it might interest state environmental regulators, especially when combined with evidence that Morrison Holdings has been using shell companies to circumvent federal oversight requirements for projects near protected waterways." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Richard Morrison stared at the documents spread across his desk, and I could see him weighing his options with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades turning obstacles into opportunities. "You've done your homework," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of grudging respect. Though I'm curious how a lumberyard employee gained access to confidential corporate documents. I wasn't always a lumberyard employee, I replied, thinking of my years in military intelligence, the skills that had served me well in understanding how powerful people protected their interests. And I still have friends who believe that communities like Cedar Falls deserve protection from predatory development practices. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with the intensity of someone reassessing a previously dismissed opponent. Assuming for the sake of argument that these documents represent a significant complication for Morrison Holdings' development timeline, he said slowly, "What exactly are you proposing?" "Leave Cedar Falls alone," I said simply. "Find another location for your resort project, one that doesn't require destroying a community that's been here for over a century. Let Emma make her own choices about her life and career without threats or manipulation. And maybe consider that there are more important things than profit margins and market dominance. And in exchange, these documents disappear, along with the copies I've already sent to certain interested parties with instructions to release them if anything happens to me, my son, or Emma." Richard Morrison smiled, but it was the cold expression of a predator recognizing another predator. "You're more interesting than I initially thought, Mr. Torres. Though you're making a significant miscalculation if you think you can outmaneuver Morrison Holdings in a game we've been playing for decades." "I'm not trying to outmaneuver anyone," I replied, gathering the documents and returning them to my folder. "I'm simply offering you the opportunity to choose a different path, one that doesn't require using innocent people as collateral damage in your family dynamics." As I stood to leave, Richard Morrison called after me with words that carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Emma will return to Morrison Holdings, Mr. Torres. If not Friday, then eventually. She's my daughter, and she understands that family loyalty ultimately trumps romantic sentiment. You're offering her a life of limitations, while I'm offering her the world." "Maybe," I said, pausing at his office door, "but I'm offering her the choice, and sometimes that's worth more than all the power and money in the world." The Cedar Falls Community Talent Show had been an annual tradition for 37 years, a small-town celebration where neighbors gathered to share music, poetry, and performances that ranged from charming to memorably awful. This year felt different, charged with an undercurrent of anticipation that had nothing to do with Mrs. Henderson's usual accordion rendition of Amazing Grace or the high school drama club's ambitious attempt at Shakespeare. Emma had been quiet since our confrontation with her father 3 days earlier. She still came to the community center each afternoon, but the easy conversation had been replaced by a thoughtful silence that felt heavy with unspoken decisions. I knew she was weighing impossible choices, trying to find a path forward that wouldn't sacrifice either her freedom or the community that had unknowingly sheltered her. "I want to play tonight," she told me that Friday afternoon, her fingers moving absently over the piano keys. "At the talent show. With you." "Emma, you don't have to prove anything to anyone," I said, understanding the weight behind her words. "Especially not to your father." "I'm not doing this for him," she replied, turning to face me with a determination I hadn't seen since the day we met. "I'm doing this for me. For Luke. For this community that's given me something I didn't even know I was missing." That evening, the community center filled with folding chairs and families, the scent of homemade cookies mixing with the sound of children's laughter and adults catching up on weekly gossip. Luke sat in the front row, beaming with pride that his father and Emma would be performing together. I spotted several faces I recognized from town council meetings, people who had been quietly worried about rumors of outside development interest, but hadn't known how to fight back. Then I saw Richard Morrison enter through the back doors, his expensive suit standing out among the casual attire of Cedar Falls residents. He had come to collect his daughter, to witness what he probably assumed would be her final performance, before returning to the corporate world he had designed for her. When our turn came, Emma and I took our places at the old upright piano that had brought us together. She had chosen the piece we would play, a duet arrangement of The Way You Look Tonight, that blended classical technique with jazz improvisation, creating something that belonged entirely to this moment, this place, these people. As we began to play, something magical happened in that small community center. The music filled the space not just with sound but with story. with the understanding that some connections transcend background and circumstance. Emma's classically trained precision provided the foundation, while my jazz sensibilities added warmth and spontaneity. Together, we created something neither of us could achieve alone. But it was more than just music. As Emma played, her shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. Her face lit up with joy that had nothing to do with technical perfection and everything to do with sharing something beautiful with people who appreciated it simply because it came from the heart. This was who she was when freed from expectations and obligations, when allowed to create rather than perform. When the final notes faded, the applause was immediate and heartfelt. Luke jumped to his feet, clapping with the enthusiasm only an 8-year-old could muster, and the rest of the audience followed suit. These weren't critics or industry professionals. They were neighbors and friends celebrating something genuine and beautiful in their midst. Richard Morrison stood quietly in the back, his expression unreadable. After the show, he approached us with measured steps. His usual commanding presence somehow diminished in this setting, where success was measured in smiles rather than profit margins. "That was lovely," he said to Emma, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Your mother would have been proud." Emma's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected mention of her late mother, and for a moment, father and daughter looked at each other across years of complicated history and accumulated hurt. "I'm staying, Richard," Emma said quietly but firmly. "Cedar Falls, the community center, the life I'm building here. This is where I belong." Richard Morrison looked around the community center, taking in the worn wooden floors, the mismatched chairs, the piano that had seen better decades. Then he looked at his daughter's face, radiant with happiness he hadn't seen in years. "Morrison Holdings will be focusing our development efforts elsewhere," he said finally. "Cedar Falls has a certain rustic charm that should be preserved." 6 months later, Emma opened the Cedar Falls Community Music Academy in a renovated building downtown, funded by an anonymous donation that allowed her to offer lessons to anyone regardless of their ability to pay. Luke had become her star pupil, though he still preferred video game soundtracks to classical pieces. The old community center piano had been fully restored, and now occupied a place of honor in the Academy's main studio. As for Richard Morrison, he visited occasionally, usually bringing expensive sheet music and awkward attempts at rebuilding a relationship with the daughter he had almost lost to his own ambitions. Change, I learned, was possible at any age, though it required the courage to admit when power had become a prison rather than a privilege. Standing in the Academy's doorway, watching Emma teach a group of local children the basics of harmony, I understood that the best music comes not from perfect technique, but from the willingness to create something beautiful together, even when the instruments are imperfect and the audience is small. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.